Alexander Reynolds sat in his luxurious office, surrounded by piles of papers, notes, and photographs. The last few months of his life had been like a whirlwind of events, which had only now begun to calm down. He leaned back in his leather chair and gazed out the panoramic window that overlooked his vast estate. The sun was slowly setting beyond the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Alexander Reynolds sat in his luxurious office, surrounded by piles of papers, notes, and photographs. The last few months of his life had been like a whirlwind of events, which had only now begun to calm down. He leaned back in his leather chair and gazed out the panoramic window that overlooked his vast estate. The sun was slowly setting beyond the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Alexander Reynolds was 45 years old and one of the most successful businessmen in America. His fortune was estimated at billions of dollars, and his name was known to everyone who had even a slight interest in the world of big business. He had built his empire from scratch, starting with a small tech company in his parents' garage and turning it into an industry giant in just 20 years. His life was the embodiment of the American dream. The luxurious mansion in the suburbs of New York, where he had moved 5 years ago, was only the tip of the iceberg. He had villas on the French Riviera and in Tuscany, a penthouse in Manhattan, and a private island in the Caribbean. His garage was filled with collectible cars, and in a private hangar, his personal jet awaited its time. But Alexander was never the type of man to rest on his laurels. He continued to work 16 hours a day, constantly expanding his empire, making new deals, and launching innovative projects. His partners and competitors respected him for his sharp mind and business acumen, and the media often called him the King of Silicon Valley and Visionary of the Decade. However, behind the facade of success and glamour, there was another side to Alexander's life. Years spent at the top had taught him to be cautious and suspicious. He knew that in the world of big business, everyone had their hidden motives and that around every corner there could be a threat. This paranoia, as he called it himself, had saved him more than once from poor decisions and unscrupulous partners. But recently, his suspicions had grown into something more. He began to notice oddities in the behavior of some of his closest employees and business partners. Small discrepancies in reports, whispers that ceased when he appeared, strange looks and nervous smiles. All of this formed a picture that seriously worried him. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that some conspiracy was brewing behind his back. He didn't know who was behind it or what their goals were, but he was sure that it threatened everything he had built. He tried to investigate the situation through normal methods, increased security, hired private detectives, conducted an internal audit of the company. But all of this yielded no results. Those behind the conspiracy were too smart and careful to leave any traces. And then an idea came to Alexander's mind, one that at first seemed insane. What if he became his own spy? What if he could infiltrate the very heart of his home and company under the guise of an ordinary servant? This thought haunted him for several days. He considered it from all angles, weighing the risks and potential rewards. After much contemplation, Alexander made his decision. He was sitting in his office, looking out at the night skyline of New York through the panoramic window, when he finally resolved to go through with it. "This is madness," he whispered to himself, "but it's the only way to find out the truth." He began preparing for his most risky and unusual operation. The first thing he did was turn to his most trusted man, James Donovan, his personal butler, who had served him faithfully for 30 years. The next morning, Alexander summoned James to his office. When the elderly butler entered, Alexander took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "James, please have a seat. I need to have a very serious conversation with you." Sensing the unusual atmosphere, James cautiously sat down in the chair opposite his employer. "Has something happened, sir?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then began to explain his plan. As he spoke, James's eyes widened with surprise and concern. "Sir, are you sure this is necessary?" James asked when Alexander finished. "It's extremely risky. You could lose everything if you're discovered." Alexander nodded. "I understand the risks, James. But I also know that if I do nothing, I could lose everything anyway. Something is happening behind my back, and I need to find out what it is." James continued to argue for some time, pointing out all the possible problems and dangers. But seeing Alexander's determination, he eventually agreed to help. "Very well, sir," he said with a heavy sigh. I will do everything in my power to assist you. But please, be extremely careful." Alexander smiled, feeling relieved that James was on his side. "Thank you, old friend. I knew I could count on you." James was to become the link between Alexander, in his role as a servant, and the outside world, maintaining the illusion that the millionaire had simply gone on a long business trip. The next step was to develop a cover story. Alexander was to become John Smith, the new assistant to the butler, recently hired for the job. This required creating fake documents, coming up with a convincing backstory, and even altering Alexander's appearance. They spent several days working out every detail of John Smith's biography. Alexander wanted his alter ego to have a believable past that could be verified if necessary. "So," Alexander said, reviewing the prepared documents, "John Smith, 42 years old, born in a small town in Ohio. Worked in several hotels, spent the last 5 years as an assistant manager at a small private club in Chicago. Looking for work in New York to be closer to his elderly mother. What do you think, James?" James carefully studied the documents. "It looks convincing, sir. I even prepared recommendation letters from previous employers, in case someone wants to check them." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Excellent, James. Now we need to work on my appearance." He grew a beard, dyed his hair a darker color, and started wearing contact lenses that changed his eye color. He spent hours practicing speaking with a different accent, altering his walk and mannerisms. One morning, after another voice training session, Alexander asked James, "So, do I sound like a regular working guy from the Midwest?" James looked closely at his employer and slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but you still seem too aristocratic. Your posture, your gestures, they give you away." Alexander frowned. "You're right. I need to work on that." He even took a short course with a professional actor to better embody the role. The actor, unaware of the true purpose of these lessons, was puzzled by the strange request from a wealthy client to teach him how to behave like an ordinary servant. "Mr. Reynolds," the actor said during one of the sessions, "you need to relax your shoulders. A servant doesn't hold his posture like he's at a royal reception. And your hands, keep them looser, not as if you're ready to shake someone's hand at any moment." Alexander nodded and tried to follow the instructions. "Is this better?" The actor smiled. "Much better. But remember, this has to become second nature, not something you're constantly thinking about." Meanwhile, preparations for his departure were underway. Alexander announced to his partners and staff that he was embarking on a long trip to Asia in search of new business opportunities. At a board meeting, Alexander made the official statement, "Gentlemen, I will be absent for the next few months. I'm going to Asia to explore new markets and opportunities for our company. In my absence, the business will be managed by a team I trust completely." He scanned the faces of those present, trying to gauge their reactions. Most looked surprised, but there were some who, he thought, exchanged quick glances. "Does anyone have any questions?" Alexander asked. Victoria Blackwood, his closest partner, raised her hand. "Alexander, are you sure this is the right time for such a long trip? We have several important deals coming up." Alexander smiled. "I understand your concern, Victoria, but I'm confident that you will handle everything just fine without me. Besides, I'll be in touch in case of an emergency." He delegated his authority to trusted individuals, leaving clear instructions on managing the company in his absence. He sent detailed emails with instructions and expectations to every key employee. And then the day came when the plan was set in motion. On the eve of his departure, Alexander took one last look at himself in the mirror of his bedroom. The man looking back at him was barely recognizable. Dark hair, a beard, brown eyes instead of his usual blue ones, and a slouched posture. "Well, John Smith," he whispered to his reflection, "it's time to take the stage." The next morning, Alexander Reynolds' limousine left for the airport, supposedly taking the millionaire on his long journey. A few hours later, a modest taxi pulled up to the service entrance of the mansion, and out stepped John Smith with a battered suitcase in hand. James met him at the door with a serious expression. "Welcome, Mr. Smith. I hope your trip was uneventful." Fully immersed in his role, Alexander responded with a slight Midwestern accent, "Yes, thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'm glad to finally start work." As they entered the house, James quietly said, "Good luck, sir. Be careful." Alexander gave a barely noticeable nod and followed James, ready to begin his risky venture. No one, except James, knew that behind the mask of the humble and unassuming John Smith was the master of the house himself. The game had begun, and the stakes were incredibly high. The first few days in the role of John Smith were a real test for Alexander. Every morning, he woke up in a cramped servant's room, on a hard bed so unlike his luxurious orthopedic mattress. The alarm clock ringing at 5:30 a.m. felt like torture for a man used to waking up no earlier than 8. "Get up, newbie," grumbled his roommate, Frank, the gardener. "The day is long, and there's plenty of work to do." Stifling the urge to snap back, Alexander just nodded and shuffled to the communal bathroom. The cold water from the tap quickly dispelled the remnants of sleep. The days were filled with an endless series of routine tasks. He shined shoes, dusted furniture, served drinks, all things that had previously been done for him. Every movement, every task was a challenge for a man used to commanding armies of managers and closing multimillion-dollar deals. "Hey, Smith!" Martha, the head housekeeper, called out to him one morning. "You missed a spot on the mirror in the guest bathroom. Do it over." Alexander felt a surge of anger rise within him. He, a man worth billions, was being told about a dirty mirror. But he held back, simply nodding, "Of course, Martha. I'll fix it right away." However, despite the humiliation and exhaustion, this new role opened Alexander's eyes to many things he hadn't noticed before. He began to see his home and his life from a completely new perspective. One evening, while dusting in the library, he overheard a conversation between two maids. "Did you see Mrs. Blackwood's new watch?" one whispered. "They say it cost a fortune." "Yeah," the other replied. "And she was just complaining recently that Mr. Reynolds cut her bonuses. I wonder where she got the money for such baubles." Alexander tensed. Victoria Blackwood was his closest partner, and he had indeed recently reduced bonuses for top managers due to economic difficulties. This was the first piece of the puzzle that he carefully noted in his mental notebook. Gradually, the picture of the conspiracy began to take clearer shape. Alexander, with surprise and bitterness, learned that some of his closest partners, including Victoria Blackwood, were planning a hostile takeover of his company. Victoria's periodic presence in his home gave him the opportunity to keep an eye on her. Shortly before his departure, he appointed Victoria as the temporary manager of his personal assets, including the house. This decision, which at the time seemed logical, entrusting management to a close friend and business partner, now turned out to be a fatal mistake. "Mr. Reynolds believes that I can take care of his interests better than anyone else in his absence," Alexander recalled Victoria's words when she announced her new status to the household staff. Now, those words sounded like bitter irony. Victoria used her position to turn Alexander's house into an unofficial headquarters for the conspirators. Under the pretext of business meetings, she regularly invited other participants in the conspiracy to the house, giving Alexander a unique opportunity to observe their actions from within. One evening, while cleaning the study after yet another business meeting, Alexander overheard a conversation between Victoria and one of the board members. "The shares dropped another 3 points, the man said. "Our people in the press did an excellent job spreading rumors about the company's financial troubles." Victoria smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent. The lower the shares fall, the easier it will be for us to take control. How are things going with the other board members?" "2 have already agreed to support us during the vote. We're negotiating with 3 more. I think by the end of the month, we'll have a majority." Alexander barely restrained himself from revealing his presence. He realized that the conspirators were skillfully using his prolonged absence, spreading rumors about problems within the company and Alexander's own financial difficulties. But this was not the end. Every day, Alexander learned new details of the conspiracy. He discovered that Victoria and her accomplices planned not only to seize control of the company but also to completely destroy his reputation. They were preparing forged documents that would testify to financial fraud and tax evasion. "We need to make sure Reynolds can't return and challenge our actions," Alexander overheard Victoria say during another secret meeting. "Once these documents reach the tax authorities and the press, he won't be able to focus on fighting for the company." The realization of the scale of betrayal and the treachery of the people he considered friends and allies was a devastating blow for Alexander. His entire life, which he thought was solid and unshakable, turned out to be built on sand. But Alexander wasn't one to allow these revelations to break him. Instead, he used his new role to methodically gather evidence against the conspirators. He secretly copied documents, recorded conversations, and collected evidence. All the while, he walked the thin line of exposure, risking everything for the sake of truth. Every evening, locked in his small servant's room, Alexander analyzed the information he had gathered during the day, gradually piecing together the full picture of the conspiracy. He knew that time was running out. The conspirators were acting quickly and decisively. "I have to be fast," he whispered to himself, reviewing his notes. "I won't let them destroy everything I've built." One morning, while serving coffee in the meeting room, Alexander overheard a snippet of conversation between Victoria and an unknown man. "The shares dropped another 2 points," the man said. "A little more, and we can start buying them up." Victoria smirked. "Excellent. Keep spreading the rumors about the company's financial problems." That evening, sitting in his small room and reviewing his notes, Alexander felt a wave of despair wash over him. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered, staring at the long list of betrayals and intrigues. There were moments when he was close to failure. Once, Victoria Blackwood almost recognized him when he was serving her tea. She stared at his face for a long time, frowning. "Strange," she said. "You remind me of someone, Mr. Smith, ma'am," Alexander replied, trying to speak as simply as possible.
John Smith.
"I've just started working here recently." "Ah, yes," Victoria nodded, still looking puzzled. "Well, thank you for the tea, Mr. Smith." Alexander quickly withdrew, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Another time, he almost exposed himself by reacting too emotionally to news of a major deal that a simple servant shouldn't have known about. "Damn it!" he exclaimed, overhearing Victoria discuss the sale of one of the company's key assets over the phone. "What's the matter, Smith?" Frank, who was passing by, asked. Alexander quickly composed himself. "I almost dropped the vase. It's probably expensive." Frank snorted and walked on, while Alexander breathed a sigh of relief. But each time, he managed to get away with it, using his wits and acting skills. Unexpectedly, Alexander received help from Emily Chen, a new maid who started working in the house around the same time he did. Emily was a sharp and intelligent girl who quickly noticed the oddities in John Smith's behavior. One morning, while Alexander was dusting in the library, Emily approached him with a puzzled expression. "John, may I ask you something?" she began cautiously. Alexander tensed but tried to keep a calm expression. "Of course, Emily. What is it?" "I've noticed that you often linger in Mr. Reynolds' study after cleaning. And sometimes you look at the documents on his desk. Is that normal?" Alexander felt his heart race. He hadn't thought anyone had noticed his actions. Quickly collecting his thoughts, he responded. "Oh, that. You see, I've always dreamed of becoming a businessman. I just can't resist looking at the documents of a successful man." "Silly, right?" Emily smiled with relief. "No, it's not silly. I sometimes dream of a better life, too. You know, I've even noticed something interesting in those papers." From that moment on, Emily began sharing her observations and guesses with Alexander, unknowingly helping him with his investigation. Her sharp mind and attention to detail proved invaluable. Gradually, Alexander began to realize that Emily wasn't who she claimed to be either. He suspected that she might be an undercover journalist or even a private detective. Her questions were too precise, and her observations too keen for an ordinary maid. One evening, while they were working together in the kitchen, Alexander decided to test the waters. "Emily, have you ever thought about working in journalism?" he asked casually. Emily froze for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "Why do you ask?" "Well, you're very observant and ask the right questions. Those are valuable qualities for a reporter." Emily looked at him closely. "And you, John? Have you ever considered a career as a detective?" They exchanged knowing glances, but neither of them dared to fully reveal their cards. However, instead of exposing her, Alexander decided to use her help, carefully directing her attention to the necessary details. "You know, Emily," he said once, "I happened to overhear Miss Blackwood talking on the phone about some stocks. Could this be related to Mr. Reynolds' company?" Emily immediately became intrigued. "Really? What exactly did she say?" This way, Alexander could guide Emily's investigation without revealing his true identity. As time went on, Alexander increasingly felt the burden of his double life. He missed his real identity, the power and influence he once had. Sometimes, lying in his small servant's room at night, he would wonder if he had gone too far in his investigation. "What am I doing?" he whispered into the darkness. "Is it worth it?" But every time he was ready to give up and return to his usual life, something would happen to remind him of the importance of his mission. One day, he accidentally overheard Victoria talking on the phone. "Yes, we'll soon gain control of the company and use its resources for our project in South America." Reynolds would never agree to such a risk, but now it's none of his business. That night, he sat in his small room, spreading out all the evidence he had gathered, copies of documents, recorded conversations, notes on suspicious meetings and deals. It all painted an undeniable picture of a conspiracy. "It's time to end this game," he told himself, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. But before he could do anything, there was a knock at the door. It was Emily. "John, I need to talk to you," she said seriously. "I know who you really are. Mr. Reynolds." Alexander froze, unsure of how to respond. But Emily continued, "I'm a journalist investigating corporate corruption, and I think it's time for us to join forces." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, Emily, I think you're right. It's time to put an end to this conspiracy." After Emily revealed her true identity and Alexander confirmed his, they quickly devised a plan of action. Their collaboration turned out to be incredibly effective, combining Emily's journalistic skills with Alexander's business acumen. Emily used her media connections to start a series of exposés. She carefully crafted a narrative, gradually revealing details of the conspiracy but without disclosing the source of the information. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Corporate Conspiracy of the Century. Who's behind the attempted takeover of Reynolds' empire?" Meanwhile, Alexander activated his connections in the business world and law enforcement. He secretly met with several trusted board members, revealing the truth about his disappearance and providing evidence of the conspiracy. "Gentlemen," he said at one such meeting, "I know this sounds like a Hollywood movie plot, but I have undeniable evidence. Victoria Blackwood and her accomplices are not just trying to take over the company, they plan to use our resources for illegal operations." Simultaneously, Alexander contacted an old friend at the FBI, providing him with information about financial manipulations and attempts to bribe officials. The climax came with the sudden return of Alexander Reynolds. On the day of the decisive board meeting, he appeared at the company office, shocking everyone present. "Gentlemen," he announced as he entered the conference room, "I'm afraid we have a change in the agenda." Victoria Blackwood turned pale at the sight of him. "Alexander, but how? You were supposed to be in Asia." "Oh, I was much closer than you think, Victoria," Alexander replied with a cold smile. "And I know about every one of your moves." That same day, the key conspirators, including Victoria, were arrested. News of the conspiracy's exposure and Alexander Reynolds' heroic return flooded the media. A high-profile trial followed, lasting several months. Emily covered the proceedings in a series of articles, revealing to the public the extent of corporate corruption. Alexander, using the evidence and witness testimonies he had gathered, confidently presented his case in court. "Your Honor," he said in his closing argument, "this case is not just about an attempt to take over my company. It's about trust, about honesty in business, and about the fact that even the most powerful people should not be above the law." In the end, the court delivered a guilty verdict to all the conspirators. Alexander not only retained control of his company but also received compensation for the damages incurred. After the trial concluded, Alexander embarked on a large-scale reform of his company. He conducted a thorough review of all personnel, ruthlessly removing those involved in the conspiracy or sympathetic to it. "We're starting a new chapter," he announced at a general staff meeting. "Our company will be a symbol of honesty and transparency in business. We will prove that success can be achieved without compromising integrity." He introduced new corporate governance protocols, strengthened internal audits, and created a whistleblower protection system for employees reporting violations. But despite all his business successes, Alexander often thought about the months when he lived as a simple servant. He especially thought about Emily. Her courage, intelligence, and principles had left a deep impression on him. One day, Sitting in his restored office and reading Emily's latest article on corporate ethics, Alexander realized that he missed not only their teamwork but her as well. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. "Emily, it's Alexander. I was thinking, would you like to have dinner with me?" Not as a journalist with a businessman, but just as Emily with Alexander. Their first dinner took place in a small, cozy restaurant far from the city's bustling center. Both felt a slight tension, meeting for the first time not as allies in an investigation but as two people interested in each other. "You know," Alexander began after they ordered, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for that conspiracy. Without it, I would have never met you." Emily smiled, her eyes sparkling. "And I never would have thought I'd be thankful for being sent on that difficult assignment. Although, I must admit, working as a maid was not easy." They laughed, recalling their awkward attempts to pretend to be ordinary servants. The ice was broken, and the evening flowed effortlessly and joyfully. From that evening on, their meetings became regular. They enjoyed simple pleasures that had once been inaccessible to Alexander due to his status, and to Emily because of her intense work. They walked in the park, fed ducks in the pond, visited small art exhibitions, and attended street festivals. One day, during a walk through an autumn park, Emily suddenly stopped and looked at Alexander. "You've changed," she said thoughtfully. "You've become softer, I think. More open." Alexander took her hand. "That's because of you, Emily. You've helped me see the world with different eyes. To understand that there are things more important than money and power." Their first kiss happened spontaneously, while cooking dinner in Emily's apartment. Alexander, trying to help, created a real mess in the kitchen, and when Emily, laughing, wiped flour from his nose, he simply couldn't resist. However, their relationship was not without its challenges. Both were strong personalities with established views and habits. Emily sometimes criticized Alexander's business decisions, considering them not ethical enough. Alexander, in turn, did not always understand Emily's passion for risky investigative journalism. "You can't control everything, Alexander," Emily would say during one of their arguments. "The world doesn't revolve around your company." "And you can't save the whole world, Emily," Alexander would retort. "Sometimes you have to think about your own safety." But it was precisely these differences that made their relationship deep and fulfilling. They learned from each other, expanding their horizons. A significant moment in their relationship came when Emily decided to write a book on corporate ethics, based on the conspiracy against Alexander. She hesitated, not knowing how he would react. "Alexander," she began hesitantly one evening, "I want to write a book about what happened, about the conspiracy, about our investigation. I think it's an important story that could teach people a lot." Alexander remained silent for a while, and Emily began to fear the worst. But then he smiled and said, "I think it's a great idea. But with one condition, I want to be the first to read it." Working on the book brought them even closer together. Alexander helped Emily with details she might have missed, and she helped him see the situation from a different perspective. A year after their first dinner together, the book was finished and ready for publication. On the day the first copies arrived, Alexander invited Emily to the rooftop of his office building. There, overlooking the city they both loved, he knelt down on one knee. "Emily," he said, pulling out a small box, "you've taught me to see beauty in simple things. You've made me a better person. You are my partner, my friend, and my love. Will you marry me?" Emily, with tears in her eyes, simply nodded and threw herself into his arms. Their wedding was modest, contrary to the press's expectations. They exchanged vows in a small chapel, in the presence of only their closest friends and family. They spent their honeymoon traveling through small European towns, enjoying the simple pleasures of life and each other's company. Upon returning, they began a new chapter of their lives. Alexander continued to lead his company, but now with a more ethical and socially responsible approach, largely thanks to Emily's influence. Emily continued her journalism career, but also began consulting Alexander's company on corporate ethics. Together, they created a foundation supporting independent journalism and fighting corporate corruption. Their story became a symbol of how love and integrity can prevail even in the world of big business. And although life continued to present them with new challenges, they always faced them together, strengthened by their love and mutual respect.